Hey there, my name's Valija, and welcome to Reframing Asia, a fairly short but highly planned 3 episode podcast series, with each episode being roughly around 15 minutes. So, the purpose of this podcast is actually twofold. The first being that this is my senior thesis project for my undergraduate degree in English literature. And the second, and maybe the more important part here, is that I'm trying to give you a theoretical look at MinJin Lee's novel Pachinko. And over the course of these 3 episodes, I'm going to try and analyze this novel and eventually its Apple TV adaptation with a post colonial perspective over its contribution towards Asian stories in contemporary Western media and how it demonstrates the importance of culture in identity building for immigrants and minorities in the third space. So, I'm going to try and look at a collection of themes and topics, such as the formation of a diaspora and the experiences within these segregated communities, but more specifically, how the novel depicts them. So, we will look at the female presence in these immigrant stories and what that means for diaspora communities. It's also hard to ignore the influence of the West in post-colonial spaces and what Americanism and American education begins to mean for immigrants. And as we speak about culture, we also need to acknowledge the importance of food and language as cultural carriers for immigrants in a third space. And of course, lastly, we need to talk about the process of American media adapting Pachinko, what they changed, what they kept, and how this was received by global audiences. And somewhere along this, I will figure out how to section all these topics into 3 parts. But to start us off, we're going to open the discussion with forming an identity, what that entails for immigrants, and we're going to frame all this together using characters from Pachinko. So, before we start analyzing the novel with theory, it might be good to lay down some key terms, just so we all know we're thinking about the same thing, and this will perhaps explain from a very surface level why Pachinko is good case study material for this topic. So, I'm going to be using a bunch of sources, articles, research papers, just a collection of all those, just to put some of these initial ideas into perspective. So, to start off, when we talk about post colonial theory, what we typically refer to from a literary perspective and from cultural criticism is what recognizes the power relations between a former state, a sovereign state, and a colony after the period of colonial rule ends. And within this theoretical perspective, we're also recognizing the presence of racism, cultural imperialism, national culture, and cultural identity, among other things. And perhaps this shows why all of these themes and topics that I mentioned above will be of relevance to Pachinko. So, names such as Homi Bhabha and Edward Said are the forefront of post colonial discourse. Their theories discuss several different terms, one of those being hybridity, which we understand as cultural hybridity, and this explains how a third space is created within the individual, and it ends up being a mix of cultures from 2 or 3 different sides. We're gonna see that in some of our characters in Pachinko too, and I will discuss it later on. But both the colonizer and the colonized come together in some way, and it gives birth to a new type of culture. So the third space starts to show a mixed space. It's almost like a negotiation between the self and the other, and it gives birth to a new cultural identity. Now, one result of this third space is the birth of diasporas. Now, we can explain the concept of diasporas by perhaps saying that they refer to exile or removal in the geographical sense, as well as psychological and cultural, because the main elements of diaspora stories, the diaspora people become immigrants due to war, apartheid, or other reasons. They leave their native land, they move to a foreign place, and not only is the space around them changing, their psychological and cultural state is also changing because not only are they carrying their past with them, but they're also adjusting to a new present that is much different from what they were born into. This forms a dual identity and it makes them neither accepted or belonging to their homeland or to the new land. And oftentimes, this is going to show an overwhelming question or theme of identity, of who am I? And at the same time, this in between state, it forms a third space, which can be shaped for the construction of a new cultural identity of the diaspora. So, the one diaspora that this podcast is going to be focusing on is the minority group Zainichi, which literally translates and refers to Koreans living in Japan. So it's also perhaps important to know that the term Zainichi cinema, or the definition of Zainichi cinema, is not about Zainichi filmmakers. So it's not about people from the diaspora representing themselves and their community on screen. Rather, the term itself, emerged as a reading position in the 1970s, mostly part of a subcultural practice of Zainichi Koreans and the Japanese viewers interested in it, and it referred to a reading of Zainichi Koreans and their traces in mainstream Japanese cinema. But later, the term and the industry evolved. There were festivals, essays, popular films, and they all collectively explored the representation of Zainichi Koreans on screen. So the label of Zainichi cinema then became legible against the backdrop of the Cold War and its effects on the processes on legal revisions that granted Zainichi Koreans relatively secure citizenship in Japan. And Kim Dae-jung's open door policy lifted a long ban on Japanese popular culture, and the Japanese cinephile community's general turn to Asia facilitated the global circulation of Sinophone films, but it also raised the profile of contemporary films from Korea. The context in which Zainichi screen images are now read is much different from the context in which the term itself emerged. When you start to think about this information, along with MinJin Lee's interviews about her novel Pachinko and what kind of research or background went into creating that novel, it all starts to make a bit more sense as a collective mode of representation of this diaspora and wanting these characters and this identity to stand on its own and represent what it is by itself rather than just being a reading of a people. So, MinJin Lee was born in Seoul in South Korea. She immigrated to the United States, with her family when she was 7 years old. She lived and grew up in the States. She was an undergrad at Yale. And this, according to her, was when she first started noticing Zainichi groups during a lecture in her junior year of college. For ethnic Koreans in Japan, the word Zainichi is considered a form of discrimination, and Min Jin Lee was moved by a story mentioned in the lecture about a Korean middle school boy in Japan who chose to commit suicide after being bullied by his Japanese classmates. Now, because of her history major, her immigrant experience, she came up with the idea of writing a story about Koreans in Japan, and that is what we now know as Pachinko. With a backdrop like this, Pachinko, the novel, follows the story of Sunja and four generations of her family in exile in Japan between the years 1910 and 1989. So, through Sunja and her family, we see the effect of Japanese colonial rule in Korea on Koreans, on immigrants, future generations of the minority ethnic groups in Japan. So, it's important to address why Pachinko becomes an important text in discussing minority Asian groups and their stories. The idea here is that Minjin Lee is not rewriting or characterizing history as wrong, but she's offering a counter to the mainstream version of history. The master narrative, or the more prominent narrative that we see in terms of history, is told and recorded by the victors, the powers in charge, and that serves as a privilege. These people are privileged elite. So Lee takes them and builds on a recent trend in historiography. She's turning away from a history dependent on written records and the anecdotes of politicians and those in power or the elite, and turns towards a more oral and decentralized focus, which means she's interviewing a variety of people, gathering their stories, people who have lived through the periods in history, and the people who are concerned within the plot of this. So this approach rejects the strong focus on written history, and it recenters the spoken form of oral history instead of traditional historiography. And a big part of this method of storytelling refers to how history has notably erased the voices of the normal man and reframed the past to look a certain way. So Pachinko cannot be understood only as a historical novel, but it's a family novel. It's engaged with the reader as a life writing text. It's combining categories of oral historical novels, family novel, intergenerational life writing, and she captures the hybridizing process of family in motion. She captures it in text, in relevance, let's say, since historical context forces the family's relocation from Korea to Japan. Pachinko is offering a portrayal of migration which goes beyond the chosen topic of a diaspora or a Zainichi Korean, but it's able to make broader statements about migration, about the process of ordinary people, which change not only individuals but families, nations, and even the course of history. So Pachinko's intergenerational characteristic becomes very important not only because of its shifting perspectives from one generation to the next, but because MinJin Lee is able to make the change of hybridization visible. And Lee also commented on the role of the fiction writer themselves being important in narrating both fiction and history. So, oral history stands as a basis for this work. The novel becomes an example of gathering migrant stories, preserving them, interpreting them in different ways in order to represent them to greater audiences. And the key point here is that there's no specific audience in mind. The stories are not meant for a marginalized community, they're meant to relate to everyone in some way, shape, or form. And Lee narrates them in a way that simultaneously makes rooms for any ethnicity to be able to relate to the themes of love, sacrifice, displacement, loss, and betrayal, among others. So, we've talked about the importance of Pachinko as a post colonial text, representing the stories of a marginalized community and connecting with people across ethnicities, but we should also talk about how the novel shows the Zainichi connecting with their history and culture. So, in my observations, the notable factors here become those of food and language, and that's what we're going to look at in this final part of the first episode. The relation to culture becomes important when we consider what living in a third space makes the immigrant feel like. From a dialogue later in the book, an older Solomon says that there's nothing you can do. The country isn't going to change. Koreans like me can't leave. Where are we going to go? But the Koreans back home aren't changing either. In Seoul, people like me get called Japanese bastard, and in Japan, I'm just another dirty Korean no matter how much money I make or how nice I am. So what the fuck? All those people who went back to the north are starving to death or scared shitless. Like, what this points to is that the connection between Asian American identity and food is quite strong. So, what this starts to mean is that when we start looking at the connection between Asian American identity and food, we see that Asian Americans have been racialized, gendered, and classed through their involvement with food by US immigration laws, limited occupational options, and media representations. Now, while this sentence that I just narrated, it refers to Asian Americans in the US, but within the context of this novel, it also applies to Sunja's family when they are adjusting to their life in Japan after immigrating. And we also see that Asian cuisine has been the most common medium through which Asian people are understood in Western society. So, food and eating, it's not necessary only for the sake of realism, but for the symbolism of the condition of the characters. It suggests the connection between food and Asian American identity. It's historically fraught. It remains significant towards exploring Asian American identity. I'm referring to this specifically to recognize the importance of food within Asian writing. It's because in Pachinko, food becomes the source of the family's survival. It has a life of its own and it gives life to the characters. because after Sunja's husband is arrested and her brother-in-law is working multiple jobs already to support the family, Sunja also starts selling banchan, sweets, kimchis, and other types of affordable Korean snacks that she can make at home in the city center from a food cart. So, in that sense, food very literally becomes the source of the survival for the family. It becomes the way Sunja affords sending Noah to college, although after realizing the total costs of sending Noah to Waseda, they're too high and they need Kohansu's help. It still does not negate how Sunja uses Korean food as a way of supporting her family for decades. So food becomes a source of remembering and connecting with native land in a physical sense, which we see when Sunja's mother buys white Korean rice from the vendor as a wedding gift for Sunja. That too, after a lot of pleading, since under colonial rule, Korean rice was reserved for the Japanese settlers living in Korea. But Young Jin wanted desperately for her daughter to taste Korean white rice before she leaves her country and moves to Japan. So, on the other hand, language becomes another way of the characters connecting to their identity, but the effects of a hybrid identity are observed more in Sunja's children and grandson because in them we see the nature of a third negotiated space emerge more and more over time. So, Sunja's children speak both Korean and Japanese fluently and become Sunja's source of navigating Japanese since she herself speaks very limited Japanese and cannot read it at all. But her sons being fluent means they have to be exposed to situations that ideally they shouldn't be, such as Noah translating Japanese for her mother as she investigates the cause of her husband getting arrested and at the police station as well. When Noah is translating, he's at the center of this chaos of human communication because he's the only person who can perform as a common language mediator. And he's also feeling a sense of displacement as a second generation immigrant who relocates and is disoriented between cultures. So, in the process of translating, he is exposed to facts about his father's arrest even before his mother has access to the information. He stands at the front of a family catastrophe when he should be the one protected from it. So, to Noah, multilingualism is a situation and a result of his cultural identity as the offspring of a Zainichi family. He has to master both languages to support the family to survive in a discriminating society. In the same way, Sunja's grandson Solomon speaks Japanese since he grew up in Japan, Korean because he picked it up through conversing with Sunja, and English because his entire school education has been at a private English school with other foreigners in Japan. So this education takes Noah onwards to the US, where he also gets a job at an American bank. So multilingualism is reflecting the characters' talents, their capacities, their status, and Solomon is considered or called the one who made it by different characters in the novel. Since he attends an Ivy League university in the US, he's turning into or evolving into the elite. However, multilingualism, it's also accompanied by insecurities in the constant pursuit of external validation. So being called the Pachinko owner's son over and over again throughout his teenage years, but also later in corporate life, Solomon bears this generational expectation and strives to shed the shame of a Zainichi offspring. He's benefited, but he's also burdened by this ability to assimilate. And cultural identities get more complicated, contradictory, and relentless. And you cannot simply resolve identity crisis by assimilation and by denial of the past. So transitioning between English, Korean, and Japanese, Solomon's language skill, it's just a symptom of adjusting and assimilating to the global metropolitan culture of a shrinking world. And these discussions on food and language open a bigger conversation on the significance of Sunja and the woman as the family sole breadwinners for several decades, and the significance of multilingualism and chasing English or America as language, education, a way of life in Solomon, which we're going to discuss in the next episode. But for now, it's important to recognize the importance of major cultural carriers as means of holding the characters in Pachinko in a rigid hold of colonial powers. There is an extreme lack of connection and relation to their own ethnicity, since characters like Noah and Solomon are inherently controlled by the Japanese and American influence, and the label of Zainichi or Pachinko owner or Pachinko owner's son, it labels them as a part of a marginalized ethnic group in Japan, and it isolates them from Japanese society itself because the society rejects them because they belong to a minority group. So the process of navigating identity and the formation of identity in a third space through Pachinko becomes necessary because it narrates the very real, everyday experiences of minorities and how multifaceted every aspect of their life is. In some ways, the option of having a choice was taken away from them due to the list of labels attached to them everywhere they went.